I've seen.
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
seen it. Yes.
And time series, or I mean cross-sectional time series.
Integrated or just?
No, I learned how to do it in cross-sectional time series way, and Laren didn't know how to do that.
Wow.
So I learned how to do it, and then I told him.
That's great. He must.
Cool.
I'm sure
so
he was
proud.
happy. Yeah.
Well, yeah, he must be so proud.
Yeah.
He was
of
a good
course.
teacher, I think.
That's really good to know. Really good to know.
Yeah. Have you been using it? Because I think it's so useful.
Yeah. Not as I thought how to use, because I find some theoretical issues that demand me attention. So that's why I didn't use yet. But I'm sure I will in near future. Yeah. That's really good to know.
It's useful. And let me know if you want to do it in cross-sectional time series, because I know how to do it. I learned because, I guess I don't need my computer. So I was mentioning to a graduate student a couple years ago, he's now done, but I was mentioning that I was trying to implement the spatial models, but in a cross-sectional time series, and I found a way to do it in Stata, but I didn't like that way because for some reasons. And he's like, I know a better way to do it, and I will send you.
Try one. Yes? Oi, boa tarde. Então, obrigado a todos por ter vindo hoje. Hoje é um dia muito importante. Eu vou falar um pouco em português, then I'm going to switch to English. Estamos muito felizes de finalmente dar a bem-vinda à professora Allyson Benton, que está aqui no departamento. A Allyson chegou em outubro. E ela tem estado aqui já ministrando uma disciplina de economia política que estamos ministrando na pós-graduação juntas. Mas esta não é a primeira vez que a Allyson está vindo ao Brasil. Faz já 4 anos que a Allyson... 3 anos. 4 anos que a gente... a Allyson tem vindo ao Brasil 4 vezes, mas a escola de verão, ela faz 3 anos que ela... tem estado participando da USP Summer School. Nas últimas 2 vezes como professora, ela está ministrando uma disciplina que se chama Designing Feasible Research Projects in Political Science, que é uma das disciplinas mais demandadas da escola. Tem sido um sucesso completo a vinda dela e a participação dela na escola de verão. E agora, this year, Allyson decided, we were brainstorming a lot about her sabbatical, and we were saying, Allyson, come to Brazil, come to Brazil. And we're really, really excited that Allyson is here. So Allyson is going to be here until we're hoping for 14 months. We're very thankful to FAPESP, that is supporting Allyson's stay in Brazil to do research for the next year. And today, Allyson is going to be giving a talk on some of the work that I understand is also part of a book project that she's going to be working on during her sabbatical. So welcome, Allyson. We're very excited that you're here in the department. It's so wonderful to have you here as a colleague for a year, and we hope this is an opportunity also for students to learn a little bit more about your work, and I'm sure that the discussion is going to be very interesting. So thanks, Allyson.
Okay, thank you, Lorena. So I have to use the mic because they're transmitting. Okay, so I can't walk around so easily.
You can walk if you grab the mic.
Yeah, it's a little awkward. Okay, so thank you, Lorena. I'm very happy to be in Brazil at USP. It's a great opportunity for me and for my research, which is on subnational political budget cycles, so subnational spending and debt policy. And I've been working on this for a few years now on the Mexico side of things. I started by looking at different kinds of debt that subnational governments take out and looking at whether or not there are any political budget cycles, any election cycles, any partisan differences, and how municipalities and state governments indebt themselves. And so this work builds on this project that I'm going to, it's really a book chapter, but it can be an article as well. I'm preparing it for submission as an article. This research builds on that research. So recently, I just had a paper come out in the Journal of Politics that talks about vertical partisan alignment. And vertical partisan alignment is when governments at the state are aligned with the federal level. And there are a couple different discussions, a couple important papers on how vertical partisan alignment, being aligned with the national president, would affect your subnational spending decisions. And the argument is that when you're fully aligned with the national president, you will spend less because you're concerned about national macroeconomic stability, because if you engage in poor fiscal discipline at the subnational level, that can undermine national macroeconomic stability, and that can have a negative impact on the president's party and president's chance of re-election, which in turn can affect your chances as well. So I
I developed a way to distinguish between two different mechanisms for how vertical partisan alignment would work to affect subnational spending decisions. And I tested this argument using 3 tiers of government in Mexico. Now, what got me thinking after I did this paper was that vertical partisan alignment, meaning fiscal policy integration with higher levels of government, that wouldn't just happen necessarily in a vertical way. That really what could also be going on is that copartisans, so just imagine fellow governors, might be looking at each other and saying, well, what's your fiscal policy this year going to be? And they might be imitating, learning from, or competing with these policies. Either way, there must, if you are gauging your policy decision on what other different governors are doing that are copartisan with you, that means that there's some sort of integration there could be some sort of integration horizontally between subnational government's fiscal policy choices. And so this has been something that I thought theoretically is plausible. And so what I did, and what in this paper, which is going to be another chapter in my book on what I call partisan fiscal policy integration or interdependence, that this is the chapter where I developed this argument to explain how this horizontal integration within parties would look and how this would affect your subnational decision making. Okay, so the paper is called Friends and Frenemies, and you'll see why. I don't know if you've heard the word frenemies when you compete with your friends. You've never heard the word frenemy? Nobody? Oh, this is a big thing. Okay, so a friend is somebody you might learn from and be happy with, and you might copy from them, but in a good way. The imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. A frenemy is someone who pretends to be your friend, but who really is competing with you. So it's enemy with a friend, frenemy, okay? So a frenemy. So frenemies would be copartisans who actually are competing with one another to get something, to rise to higher positions. And I have no idea why this word has never been used. It's like a slang word, but it's a good word, and it's very evocative in the English language. And I have no idea why this has never been used to describe what goes on within parties, because in parties you're supposed to be friends, but really you're not, because you're all competing for resources and jobs and positions. You're really frenemies. Okay, so my paper is, of course, entitled Friends or Frenemies, Explaining Copartisans Subnational Fiscal Policy Interdependence. So how do I frame this paper? So I'm going to present this paper in a way that helps you understand how I developed the paper. This is really, I'm going to target this to graduate students because I think that it's instructive to talk not just about your work, but also how you came about this work. So I told you a little bit about how I came about this project or this idea from my position. But then the issue is, how do you frame it in the literature? You always have, the reason that you get interested in something and you start to study something could be because of passion, it could because of some interest, some inside knowledge, or maybe you happen to notice a theoretical gap. I didn't come about this from a theoretical gap. I just started wondering, well, I see vertical interdependence in fiscal policy decisions in Mexico. Why not horizontal interdependence as well? So I thought, okay, so let's see what I could do with this. So I decided to take this idea for a spin, like you drive a new car, just see how it works, and it works. But you have to frame it in a literature to be convincing for reviewers when you're sending things out for review with to journals. And so I had to come up with a couple of different gaps. Now, fortunately, there are some pretty interesting gaps here, and they're pretty wide open, and they're pretty obvious to me. So the first gap is found within the political budget cycle literature. So the political budget cycle literature, one part of this literature talks about ideological partisan budget cycles, where right-leaning parties, they tend to decrease spending ahead of elections in order to show their fiscal discipline to voters, And so voters will support them at the polls, whereas the reverse is true for left-leaning parties. They tend to raise their level of spending ahead of elections to appease their voters who prefer a greater spending, and this is what helps them win elections. And one thing I noticed in this literature is that the decision for a subnational government who's deciding whether or not to engage in some sort of a partisan-based political budget cycle is taken entirely independently from what other copartisans are doing in this literature. So they're all motivated by ideology, yet they're all motivated completely independently from one another to this end. That doesn't make any sense, because at the subnational level, politicians, leaders, governors, or mayors, they're embedded within party organizations. And if they're embedded within party organizations, they have peers whom they compete with, and they must be keeping an eye on what their peers are doing. So I thought this is a pretty big gap that the economists have made. The economists were the ones that first identified these budget cycles, and then that the political scientists are continuing to make. They're treating the budget cycles of subnational governments as completely independent from one another, and that just can't be the case. The second gap is within the policy diffusion literature. There is a huge literature on national policy diffusion, but there's also another huge literature on subnational policy diffusion. That is, at the subnational level, most of it's on the United States, but it's slowly being applied to other countries, is how when a governor adopts a certain kind of social spending program, how that spreads to other states around them. And normally it tends to spread geographically with your nearest neighbors, but it can also pop around amongst copartisans as well. So this is a learning or a diffusion process. It's often... And in that literature, which is very interesting, I did a pretty thorough reading of that literature, and I noticed that there are a couple people who talk about partisan diffusion, how public policy diffuses among copartisans and not amongst your opponents who might be in other states. So if you're if you are party A from one state, you then look around to all your other party A state governors and say, hey, what have they been doing that's innovative, and should we adopt that, and would that work for our constituents as well? Because all these governors are always looking for ways to appeal to voters, to cultivate support and win elections. So they look around and they decide what works, and they learn from it, and they adopt those policies. So that's pretty interesting. But what I did find out is the people who study fiscal policy diffusion, they only study it in terms of how it diffuses to your neighbors, because their attitude is that you engage in surplus deficits or surplus you run surplus budgets or you run deficits, and that has an impact. Whether you decide to do that or not will have an impact on how voters think about you and your performance, and they're benchmarking your performance against other nearby states. But the point is that all the literature on tax policy diffusion, the literature on spending diffusion, and the literature on fiscal policy diffusion, that is deficit diffusion, it only looks geographically and doesn't go through a partisan label. And what I say is, well, if they're finding that there's partisan-based policy diffusion for some kinds of healthcare and these kinds of programs, it could be also that fiscal policy is being diffused across governments, subnational governments, for partisan reasons as well. So there are two gaps in the literature that I point out in the paper. Okay, so here's my argument. So I come up with two different alternative arguments, because this is not a good way to go about doing research, by the way. But I always do this. I don't know why. Sometimes readers love it, and sometimes reviewers don't like it, and they want me to pick a side. But I'm always really agnostic, because when you invent a new theory, even if it's based on something else, but you jump in and say, here's a new way that something could be working, and no one's ever made this argument before, I'm often very agnostic about whether or not I'm going to find any evidence for this at all. And I also know, usually, I can think of other alternative arguments which could explain exactly the same result that I am expecting to find. And so I do this frequently. I did this in the JOP article. I do this in other papers that I've published. I just put up some alternative arguments, and then I see where the data falls. And I like that. Sometimes reviewers don't like it. Sometimes they do. And if reviewers don't like it, they don't reject my papers for it. They just say, pick a side, and then we'll see how it goes. And usually there's one side that you can pretend you actually agreed with more, but usually I'm totally agnostic. So the first argument is just a simple application of that diffusion argument that I told you about, that partisan-based diffusion argument to the fiscal policy arena. So I didn't have to do anything fancy to get that argument. That argument just takes a well-known argument and says, look, if it's happening for healthcare policy and these public policies, then it could also be happening for fiscal policy, and I just adjust the argument a bit to fit the fiscal policy world. But there it is. Just take that and say, hey, it could be that fiscal policy diffuses among subnational governments simply because they learn what appeals to their constituents. So you look around to your similar party people and you say, hey, governor of my same party, look, that guy did this. He ran a fiscal surplus and his voters really loved it. We're going to do that too. And we're going to win re-election or a deficit. The other argument is my partisan-based fiscal policy competition argument. And this argument, it hasn't been made before. It builds on two different literatures that have kind of said something sort of similar, but I actually say it in my own way and set out the causal chain very explicitly. So what is that causal chain? Okay, so here's the friends argument. Let's go through the learning argument. So here's a graphical depiction of how you would learn. So here you have the national government up here. President A is in power, or Party A is in power. Here's Party A at some subnational level of government, could be state, could be municipal. And here you have the Party A people in different states all learning and copying each other in order to appeal to voters. Which policy works best with voters, and Party B is doing the same thing. Okay, so my argument, the Frenemies argument, is about competition. And what I argue is subnational leaders' efforts to outcompete their copartisan peers to appease higher-level party leaders leads to subnational fiscal policy competition. So how does this work? Here you have your parties. You're looking around to your other state governments of your same party label, and you're saying, what are they doing? What are they doing for their fiscal policy choices? But you don't do this because you're trying to appeal to voters. You do this because you're trying to appeal to party leaders. And if it's true that you try to enact the fiscal policy preferences of your immediate party leaders because they have an important role in the development of your political careers, you, in order to advance within your party to fewer and fewer and fewer posts at higher and higher levels, you have to not only appease party leaders, you have to outcompete your copartisan peers as well in order to demonstrate to party leaders that you are doing it better than other governors are doing it. So if you're running a surplus, you run an even bigger surplus. If you're running a deficit and cranking up spending in order to win elections, you're doing that, and you're doing that even better. Okay, so this is how that works. So you're competing here with the aim, of appealing to party leaders, not voters. Voters play no role. So you can see how these arguments predict exactly the same thing. They predict, the learning argument predicts that you're coordinating around, you're learning from, but coordinating around your similarly ideologically placed copartisans in other governments, and other similar level governments. Okay, so you get that coordination as a result of that. But the other argument says that that coordination actually arises through a completely different mechanism, one that prioritizes how politicians would compete each other, thus coordinating their policy preferences in order to appease party leaders instead of party voters. Okay, so in every paper, you have to have an empirical strategy for testing your argument. And I had to be very careful because I'm testing between two different arguments that predict exactly the same thing. So I have to find a way not only to show that you get this coordination, but I have to show it's via one mechanism as opposed to another mechanism. And that's a fun thing to do. I really like doing that. I think that that's the hardest part of what we do, and I think that's the funnest part of what we do. Okay, so my empirical strategy is to look at state-level fiscal policy. And I look at actually debt. Mexico is a very crazy place, not just these days. It's just a crazy place, generally speaking. It's fascinating because state and municipal governments are technically, formally not allowed to run fiscal deficits. So they don't report fiscal deficits, yet they all do it. How do they do it? They take out these authorized loans that are called short-term bridge loans that are supposed to only be used for accounting purposes. When you need to make payroll, you need to pay the light bill, but you haven't gotten your transfers yet. You take out a short-term loan, then you get your end-of-the-year transfer, and then you pay off the loan, and then your account comes to zero at the end of the year. You're fine. But they take up these short-term loans, and then they just don't pay them. They don't pay them back. And so they let the loans accumulate, though they say that they're only taking out these loans in order to close fiscal accounts. And this is how, in practice, they run unsanctioned fiscal deficits. The banks that provide them with the short-term loans are usually the ones that refinance these short-term loans into larger, longer-term loan packages. So they're commercial banks that do this. The development bank cannot do this. The development bank can only make loans for infrastructure. And state governments and municipal governments in Mexico are allowed to take out long-term debt, not short-term debt, long-term debt to finance infrastructure investment. So big capital investment, public works projects. So what I do is I take advantage of the fact that commercial bank loans are being used to finance deficits in addition to infrastructure investment, and that development banks cannot be used to finance fiscal deficits. I take advantage of these two kinds of debt to tease out differences in the arguments. Okay. So I have 32 states, including the federal district. The time period that I look at is this time period. This has to do with data availability for the start point, and the end point has to do with the end of the actual regulatory regime managing debt, how states get to access debt. So I can't use years after that because it's under a different regulatory regime. And anyway, I have some years here. I've got 11 years. Okay. And then I have a whole bunch of control variables here for other things that might affect your tendency to take out debt. There are many other reasons why a state or a municipal government might want to take out debt, socioeconomic, developmental, et cetera, reasons, and I have controls in there for all of those things. Okay, so here's what I expect. So I'm leveraging these two different debt instruments to distinguish between the arguments. And what I argue is that if the fiscal policy learning mechanism, so you're just learning from your copartisans, is working, you should not only learn from their commercial bank debt expenditures, but you should also learn from their development bank debt expenditures, and you should copy those as well. And here's why. You are, in this argument, trying to appeal to voters. And so voters cannot distinguish between expenditures undertaken with commercial bank debt and expenditures undertaken with development bank debt, even if governors know this. They know the difference. They know what can finance fiscal deficits, and they know what can finance infrastructure projects, but voters don't know that. And so if you see some other state governor who's successfully winning elections and making everybody really happy, you not only copy their commercial bank debt, you copy their development bank debt as well. And so you tend to converge not with your copartisans in the level of commercial bank debt that they have, but also in the level of development bank debt that they have, even though the development bank debt is not financing fiscal deficits. It's financing infrastructure. However, this expectation is a bit different if you're trying to appeal to party leaders. So you look around and you say, hey, this kind of a deficit in this situation is really appealing to the party leader. So I better do the same thing with my fiscal deficit, that is, with my commercial bank debt. But party leaders know the difference between commercial bank spending and development bank debt spending. They know what can finance fiscal deficits, and they know that development banks don't do that, and development banks finance infrastructure investment. So if you are a state governor trying to compete with other copartisan state governors in order to appeal to party leaders, you will compete on commercial bank debt and thus you'll get convergence in the level of commercial bank debt to high or to low degrees, depending upon your situation. But you will not need to do this with development bank debt. You can undertake your development bank debt spending based on whatever your needs are in the state, and that those needs don't have to be the same as other copartisans. Okay? So this, you have, for these two mechanisms, these two mechanisms have very different expectations from one another on development bank debt, even though you would expect to see exactly the same thing on commercial bank debt. So this is how I'm leveraging these two kinds of debt, these two types of instruments for financing public spending in order to see which of these mechanisms is at work. So how do I do this? When you're looking at interdependence, you have to use spatial econometrics. And fortunately, 2 years ago, I was so lucky as to take Laren Williams' spatial econometrics course at the IPSA USP summer school. So I cannot, is he teaching it this year? Okay, so he's coming this year. It's not too late to enroll, I hope. It's a great class. I learned a lot, and then I continued learning after I took the class. That class sets you up to then learn. So you learn cross-sectional spatial econometric models in that class, and then I went on to learn how to do this in the cross-sectional time series format. But I had all the tools, thanks to his class, to do that. So here's what, for those of you who do statistical models, here's what a spatio-temporal econometric model looks like. Okay, so you've got here, you have your dependent variable, you have your weights matrix. This is for how all of your, in my case, all of your states are related to each other, whether they're copartisan or not. Then you have the lag dependent variable, which you have to have in there. You have all your covariates, and then you have your error term. This W is the most important thing in the spatial econometric world. This W, the design of it, is how you're telling the computer how your states, in my situation, in my case, are related to one another. So it could be geography. That's just the way that most people implement this. Are you a neighbor with this other state? So imagine Brazil, and you've got like states, and Sao Paulo, who's its neighbor with to the south, who's its neighborhood, who's in its neighborhood, who actually borders it. That's typically how people implement a spatial weights matrix. But I don't care about geography, remember? What I care about is whether or not states are copartisan with one another. So I don't care where they are on the map in Mexico. I just care which states have a copartisan or not. And so I set up a spatial weights matrix which looks at whether you have copartisan peers and who they are across states. And I do one of these weights matrices for every year, so 32 by 32 states for 2005, for 2006, 2007, 2008, and I create this huge spatial weights matrix, and then I put it into the model, and that's how I run the model. Okay? So this is how this W is very important. Now, there's also another thing that I'm not going to go into because it gets a little technical. This is more for, I prepared this more for a technical audience, but there are different ways that you can specify the spatial weights matrices, and then I have different reasons why you would want to specify it one way for one of the arguments and the other way for another argument. I won't go into that. It's a little crazy, but I do that. And you can either just, well, anyway, okay. So the first thing that you do when you run spatial models is you do some what are called spatial diagnostics tests. And all you're looking here for is whether or not, so here's commercial bank debt, here's development bank debt. And what I was looking for was in this row, whether or not these test statistics were significant or not, demonstrating that there would be a spatial lag, that there could be some sort of interdependence in commercial bank debt across copartisan states and across development bank debt. And what I get here is something very suggestive that there is spatial interdependence. Yes, in the commercial bank debt, but no in development bank debt. But again, this is just a test statistic to see in the raw data how the raw data on these kinds of debt are relating to the data for other states across time. That's all this is doing. So I did that, and I was thinking, okay, this is good. Now you have to run the model with the covariates, because I haven't controlled for anything yet. So the next thing I do, so that's, let me go through this. Okay, so the next thing I do is I run this. I'm just going to show you the non-row standardized spatial weights matrices, the way I specified the weights matrix for one type. And what I'm looking for here is to see what is happening on what's called the row term. This is the coefficient for the spatial weights matrix. Am I getting a positive and significant coefficient? Why do I want a positive and significant coefficient here? What this is telling me is that states that have high fiscal deficits that are copartisan tend to have their copartisans also have high fiscal deficits. States that have low fiscal deficits and are copartisans, they tend to have converge around low fiscal deficits with their copartisans. There's a positive relationship, okay, between the two. And so this is what I'm looking for. And what I found here is for commercial bank debt, yes, this row term, the coefficient for the spatial weights matrix was, as I had hoped it would be, positive and statistically significant. And here I had, no state fixed effects and then state fixed effects over here. And I get the same thing even when I include state fixed effects. So that's very important. And here, tellingly, I have, for development bank debt, I have no spatial interdependence in between states in their level of development bank debt. And these two findings together are consistent with my story that it is through actually political competition, copartisan fiscal policy competition, that we're getting this, that this process is playing out. So now, there are two other things that I note here that are also very important. Now, these are the covariates in the model. So I have vertical partisan alignment. So if I'm right and you are competing with your copartisans in order to appease higher level party leaders, what else do I need to find in my results? That you actually care about who your party leaders are, that actually if you're aligned with the president, you tend to behave differently from when you're not aligned with the president. And this is what I find. If it is in fact true that states are trying to appease higher level party leaders, remember what I told you at the very beginning. When you're aligned with national presidents, you tend to spend less because you're worried about the effect of macroeconomic stability on the president's party at the polls, the performance at the polls, and thus your own performance at the polls. And so you want to appease them, appease party leaders, in this case your president, your copartisan president, so that you do well. And what I find here is that, yes, indeed, when a governor is aligned with the national president, they spend less. Okay, and so for my partisan competition argument to be working, you care about what it is your party leaders are doing, and you should thus, whether or not they are aligned with you or not and in power or not, should have an effect on your spending choices, and that's what I find. Also, if it isn't true that you're motivated by a political rationale of which this is a part, you should also be timing your expenditures and your commercial bank debt around elections. And what I see here is that vertical partisan alignment or not, you do get greater commercial bank debt in election years as opposed to non-election years. Okay, so this is all fine. You see the coefficients, and we know that you're supposed to demonstrate marginal effects. You're supposed to tell people what this actually means substantively so that people can actually take those coefficients and translate them into something meaningful for the world. And so here's what this means in Mexico. Let's look at the vertical partisan alignment first. These are square root terms. So this is about 10 here, okay? And this is like, I don't know, a couple centavos. Or it doesn't look like much. So what you see here is that when you are aligned with your state governor, let's just look at the left-leaning PRD, okay? Or let's look at we'll look at the right-leaning pawn. If you are aligned, if you're a governor aligned with the national president, you tend to spend about 10 pesos less, okay, 3 squared, about 10 pesos less than other governors who are not from your party, okay? So that's interesting. That doesn't seem like very much, does it? But think about this. This is per capita. In states that range from 500,000 to 14 million people in Mexico, that could be a lot of money. Just one time, one state. Add this up across all other states that are doing this, and add this to the effect that this has on your peer states. What this shows here is when a pawn state chooses, because it's aligned with the national president, chooses to spend less, it not only affects her decision, but it affects all of her other copartisan peers by a small amount. So you have to imagine this aggregating per capita across states and through the effect that your decisions have on your peers and through the effect of their decisions on you. That 10 pesos can end up being a lot of money just in 1 year. That's 1 year. Okay? So this actually has a substantively very important effect, that copartisan interdependence, that copartisan competition that I was laying out, and then that competition, when you're aligned, your competition to demonstrate that to higher level party leaders that control the national government, that you're being fiscally responsible, that causes competition with your copartisan peers to do the same thing, and all your deficits go down. And here's another example with gubernatorial elections. It's the same thing. If the PAN has a gubernatorial election similar to these, that's worth about 8 pesos. They spend about 8 pesos more during a gubernatorial election. That bleeds through and affects affects spending by other copartisans that are competing, aggregated across per capita, across people in the state, doing this for every state that's having a gubernatorial election in 1 year, and then across time, that can be a lot of increased spending just because of this competition to outcompete, to outspend your copartisans. Okay, so that's great. So here's what I find. I find that, yes, we've got the commercial bank debt interdependence and no interdependence amongst the development bank debt, consistent with the fiscal policy competition mechanism, inconsistent with the fiscal policy learning mechanism. So I presented this paper in Boston at the International Political Economy Society, and some really smart famous professors who were listening said something really good. They said, this is really great. This is really unusual. This is very clever. But here's where it came. If they're all competing with each other and doing the same thing, then how do they distinguish themselves from each other? And I said, yes, I know. I haven't gotten to that part yet. That's a really great point, and I have to figure out a way to deal with this point. So I started thinking about it, and I started looking around. So if everybody is either converging to higher spending or converging to lower spending in order to be the one that outcompetes and appeals to their party leader in order to rise up to other posts, then how is it that the party leader can even choose between them because they're all doing the same thing? And so this is where you have to start thinking about, well, how is it that they can innovate in their budgets? How is it that they can innovate in their spending? And so I've started to look at tax policy innovation, and I presented a tiny little bit of that last week at Lorena's workshop, because I was thinking about tax policy innovations and how that might be how they're distinguishing each other. That is not what I do here. What's interesting about Mexico is that there are 2 other kinds of debt that you can use to finance subnational spending, infrastructure investments, bonds, and public-private partnerships that are conducted through trusts, these legal trusts that they send up. The bond emissions are very interesting. They're really hard to set up. They're very costly in terms of time and money to set up a bond emission, especially a state government. They usually don't have high capacity. They have to bring in people who really know how to do this. They have to hire consultants. But once you do it, you can do some pretty innovative things. You can say, tie your bond repayments to future tax collections or future fee collections on the project that you're actually financing, as opposed to using your fiscal transfers as a guarantee, which is what they normally do. You can actually have, you can say, hey, I'm going to build a road system. I'm going to extend my road system, build toll roads through my states, and I'm going to repay those bonds that are financing this huge public works project through the tolls that are to come in the future. That's super innovative, and that's harder to do with the commercial bank debt. They usually and almost always want you to tie your future payments to future fiscal transfers that are guaranteed, but nobody knows what the toll collections are going to look like. But you can do that with a bond emission. And so what I looked for, and here's what I wanted to find, is that in bond emissions, that there are states who venture out to emit these bonds and to set up these very innovative pay schemes for repaying them, and that they diverge from one another. So what I want to find here is that copartisans are not copying each other on this, and in fact, they're diverging. They're doing the opposite of what everybody else is doing, because that's how you show innovation. That is how you distinguish yourself from your copartisans, is by doing something different. Okay? So what do I want to find here? I want to find a negative coefficient on the bond emission row term. Okay, so I just said all that. Here's what just look at the bond emission. So if you're just learning, because voters can't tell, you would have a positive coefficient on the row term. You'd have positive interdependence. You'd be just copying each other with the bond emissions. But if you're trying to be innovative and different to distinguish yourself, you should have a negative interdependence, okay? Don't look at trust debt. Trust debt, I expected the same thing with the public-private partnerships, but I think I don't have enough observations of these trust debts to actually get good results, so I don't trust those results. So here's what I find for bond debt. Let's just look at the bond debt. Look at that. I get actually a negative and statistically significant row term showing there's interdependence, and that they're avoiding each other, not copying each other, which is what I had expected on the bond debt, regardless of whether I have no state fixed effects or state fixed effects. And also, I get that this is happening, that you're also, interestingly enough, you're raising your bond debt when you're aligned with the national parties. I can't explain that. I don't know why. But that you don't do this around gubernatorial elections. Now, I can explain why you're not doing undertaking greater bond debt around elections is simply because I think it's too hard for them to time the actual emission. I just think it's too hard for them to set it up and to get it all running. But this I have to investigate and see why I'm getting a positive instead of a negative coefficient on that. But that I'm getting anything that means that they actually care about what their party leaders do means that, yes, they are trying to appease party leaders. So that's good. I just don't understand why I'm getting positive coefficient. So what is my conclusion? I think that I have some evidence of partisan-based fiscal policy interdependence amongst Mexican states, and I think I have enough evidence to show that this occurs as a result of the competition and the effort to appease higher-level party leaders and not voters, not through the learning process. So what are my next steps? So for those of you who read the paper, there are a couple things that I need to do, I think, before I send it out for review. The first thing I need to do is I need to put in some couple paragraphs. I mentioned some of these innovative bond cases, but I need to put a couple paragraphs in there to talk about these innovations and how they were so different and under what circumstances did they occur. So that is my big plan for next week, I hope. I have to figure out what's going on with the trust debt. I need to open up, know your data. Open that. I've looked thoroughly at the bond data and who's been emitting the bond data and when they were doing it and what the emissions were looking like and reading about the bond emissions. But the trust stuff I haven't been reading about. So I'm not sure if I'm going to include it or not. There have only been a couple, so I'm thinking I'm just going to exclude it. And then what I really want to do, but I probably won't include it in this paper, I'll probably just send this paper out like it is, because I think with the states, it's probably enough. But I really want to replicate all of this at the municipal level. But remember that spatial weights matrix, that N by N by T? No. So I've asked Laren and another, this graduate of University of Michigan, to help me automate that, because you can't do that by hand. So yes, that's my next goal, probably for the book. Anyway, so thank you very much.
Okay, so maybe we can open the floor to questions and comments. Glauco? See? Glauco's thinking.
I really like the paper. It's very clear, it's very didactic. You understand everything you said. But I think I don't understand a part of your mechanisms, explanations. I got one question for the learning and one question for computing mechanisms. When you say about the learning mechanism, you say that it seems to me that you are dealing, although we are controlling for a lot of social demographic variables, I think you are not controlling for inequality. It seems to me. I have to
Start over.
Okay. No, I got a question for learning mechanism and for computing mechanism. When you say about learning, because you're not controlling for inequality, and it seems to me rich and poor demands differently from government spending, and it differs how government will respond to that. So although you are controlling for some variables, as I don't remember all of them, but human development index.
I have a human development index, and I have total fiscal revenues per capita, square root, and GDP per capita.
But do you
and
think,
the
yeah,
population.
do you think they capture the same effect? I'm not sure. I'm just thinking actually about this, because we know Marta's research showing all the time that we expect to find different spending effects when you have more inequality or less inequality. I don't think they are exactly the same. And I know inequality doesn't change a lot through years. It's not in the 10 years time frame. I don't think we're going to find a lot of difference. I don't know. And for competing, I was just wondering why governors try to appeal to their leaders as through their fiscal. I don't know how to say that. Their behavior, or they're good managers or fiscal managers. How they can deal with money. I think that's the main drive for their actions. You know, I don't know if I'm not sure if. Why is that? Why they are not? They may. And a third question is: are all the states the same in importance through inside each party? For instance, in Brazil, we expect some states to be more important than others. If you're dealing with the party leadership, for some states, I don't think they really. They're not as much important as the other states. I don't think they are all the same in terms of political relationship within the party. So if Minas Gerais state do something, Bahia state does something, I think they're going to be more relevant through their regions. So they're more important than the others. They're not all the same. Okay, so just some.
Okay. All right. Do you want us to go around questions and then you answer? Or you want to answer?
Oh.
How do you
Okay,
prefer?
well, those are 3 questions.
Okay.
Can I just take it one by one, because I'm not going to remember?
Yes.
I think it's hard. It's hard for me anyway. Okay. Whoa. I don't know what's going on. It's tipping. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, do I control for inequality? Well, I can give you the statistical answer, which is yes, I do. look at this. I control for the best things that we have available in Mexico. It's trustworthy data. And then I run everything on state with state fixed effects. So I'm like, well, whatever. There's differences between states. I've controlled that out. But let me jump to the third point. Not all states are equal. And so who you learn from or who you compete with would be different depending upon how important the states are. And states are, the more populated states tend to be more important politically because they bring more votes. So we have a single round presidential election. None of this runoff stuff in Mexico. We've got a single round, which means you can win with very little support. And so if you come from a big populated state, you already get a lot of votes, and that really helps you. So presidential candidates have tended, since Mexico democratized in 2000, they have tended to come from large states, okay, with the exception of the current president, who's from a small state. But I control for state population because there is this, could be a population effect as well. But I think you bring up a good point, though, because one thing, you may not learn or compete. If you're not learning or competing the same, or you don't take your copartisan peers as seriously who are from small states, you don't learn as much for them, you don't feel the need to compete with them, that means that I should probably adjust the spatial weights matrix for a population. Okay, and I had never thought of doing that. So that's a fantastic suggestion, and I can definitely do that, place more. I'm giving every state equal weight, okay? But what I could do is adjust those weights by population to see, and I would expect that that would matter even more. So if a tiny state is running a fiscal surplus, who cares? That could just be an exception. But if a large state's running a surplus and they have lots of demands on them, and they're less, and then you might want to take note of that, because you might want to see, I'm doing just what such a state of Mexico or Oaxaca or Veracruz are doing, which are big populated states. So that's a really good point. Now, this is a good question. Is it that state governors or mayors only try to outdo each other in the fiscal policy realm? Well, of course not. They're trying to outdo each other on all kinds of realms all the time. But I'm in the political budget cycle world in literature, and I understand that all these other things could be going on, but all else being equal, if somebody outbids you on your fiscal policy, you could be then. It doesn't matter how many good things you've done if everybody else has done those good things too, and then your competitor also outbids you on fiscal policy. Then you're not going to be the one who's promoted. So all else being equal, or all other competition, or all other learning being equal, you have to do what you can. So I'm thinking of this in sort of an all else being equal world. But certainly they're innovating in other ways, and certainly they're competing on other dimensions as well.
Is this working? Okay. Thanks, Allyson. So apologies, I haven't read the paper in detail yet, but
I'm sure you're the only one.
I've been shamed, sorry.
No, you're not the only one. Everyone else has been shamed.
No. But I guess three questions, which are a little bit more my lack of understanding, and I wonder if you could maybe help clarify. One question I had was, like you described for the bonds, the development debt seems like it would take a lot longer to set up, right? Like if I'm just getting an overnight bridging loan, you just call the bank and say, like, give me the money, right? Whereas if you want to do an infrastructure project, you probably have to at least write what you want to do and then have a project designed. So I wonder if can the null findings that development debt doesn't matter just be explained by the fact that they take a lot longer to set up. There's a lot of variation in how long it takes before the bank grants you that debt. And so the sort of temporal coincidence, right, that the neighboring states get them at exactly the same time, which is what's picking up in the model.
The copartisan.
The copartisan states do it at the same time. It's just harder to do it at the same time because in state A, the bank is really efficient, and state B, it's not efficient. So it just, they get them, but they get them 6 months apart or a year apart, right? And so I just wonder if there's something that makes it harder for you to find an effect for these longer-term bonds. And then, so my second question was very much reflecting that I need to take Laren's class, I think, but I wasn't convinced, I guess, why you need the spatial weights matrix for these copartisan states. Why, like, if I was to do this, like, my naive approach would just be put a dummy indicator for they're a copartisan state. What is the gain by putting the spatial weights matrix? And I think that would be useful for us to learn. And then thirdly, I'm sure I'm missing something, but how do you know that there's this horizontal competition beyond the vertical trying to impress your boss at the national level? Because if Lorena and I are in the same party, then by definition our boss is a copartisan for her and for me, right? So if we're both in the PAN and the president is from the PAN as well, then that we're both working towards this collective good of maintaining fiscal responsibility. And so we're both moving in the same direction. But for there to be competition, there has to be an additional, I want to do more than her and she wants to do more than me.
Right.
And so I get that they're all going in the same direction. I wasn't quite sure how I can be sure that there's an extra competition element rather than just the common pool working in the same direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so these are all good questions, and if you have them, then reviewers might have them as well. So this is good because I'll note these things as well. And I'm going to do the population-weighted spatial matrix now, so that 1 week is now suddenly turned into 1 month. No, but it's better to do everything and put all the bells and whistles that you can on it before you send it rather than after, because they still find more reviewers. Okay, so it might just take longer to set up development bank debt. Well, no, not in Mexico. There's one big development bank debt that's funding everybody. It works the same across all states, across all municipalities. It is the go-to. There are far more development bank loans than there are commercial bank loans. And in fact, that's been the problem. The government has turned to recently offering development bank sponsored insurance to banks so that municipalities and states will actually start going to commercial banks so that they stop going to, because the demand is so high, and they get them pretty fast. And in fact, so the commercial banks, the short-term lending is super easy. You go to the bank that funds your payroll and say, hey, we have a problem today, the retail bank. So they're all the banks that you see on the street here, like Santander, and then there are others there. That's where they're borrowing money from. They're just going to the bank and borrowing money, sometimes a lot of money, especially at the state level. And you can get short-term loans really easily, really fast. But the thing is, to refinance those loans into a longer-term loan package, then suddenly all of the banking regulation kicks in. And you have to have credit ratings reports, and you have to demonstrate fiscal solvency, and the banks have to have capital weight. They have to hold capital that is adjusted to your credit rating. And so the banks all have investors. And so banks do not take these decisions lightly, and nor does the development bank. So it's the short-term loans, yes, they're super fast, but what I'm getting at is all of commercial bank lending, which is really, this is the long-term debt. There's no data on the short-term. They don't have to report that. But all the long-term financing is indeed very hard to get as well, just as it would be the development bank. In fact, the development bank debt's probably easier to get because they don't have the kind of oversight and regulations that affect the private sector banking system. And recall that Mexico's had a couple banking crises, and so the banks are very tightly regulated there, and they don't make quick and easy loans. Okay, so let me go then to the other theoretical type. That was substantive theoretical. Then I'll go to the methods question. How do I know that this horizontal competition exists? So we're all members of the same party, and we're all working to the same goal, either to make our national party leaders who are in power happy by demonstrating fiscal discipline, or by making our national party leaders who are out of power happy by spend so that you can generate support to unseat local and national governments. So one of the two. Why aren't you all moving only to this collective goal in a very sincere and non-strategic way? Well, the way that this works in Mexico is that party leaders are gatekeepers to a higher level office. So you can all work to the same and common goal, but you can't rise within the system if you're not demonstrating that you're working for that common goal even better than your fellow copartisan. And so you can't, and this is particularly important in Mexico at the subnational level during this time period because they had no immediate reelection. So you had to rotate to other offices, and the party leaders controlled all access to all offices. So state leaders controlled the access of all municipal level people and all state people to state offices and sometimes to federal deputy ballot positions. And the national party leaders control the access of all state leaders and municipal leaders and politicians to all nominated party positions as well as elected ballots, etc. So it's precisely because you're trying to survive in this vertical party structure where you have to move around every 3 or 6 years and you're entirely dependent on party leaders, which is what cranks up that need to not just work for the common goal, but to show that you're doing it better than your copartisans. So this is why I expected to find what I found in the Mexican case, because that incentive structure is so strong to appease your party leader. One of the reasons that I'm here in Brazil is because I don't know if that's happening in Brazil. Because party leaders are important in Brazil, but they don't play the gatekeeping role not nearly the gatekeeping role that they do in Mexico. You can't even get on the ballot in Mexico unless your party leader puts you there. So you are always in this mode of appeasement, and competing to look better. And in Brazil, it's easier to get on the ballot. It's not entirely easy, but it's a lot easier here. So I'm not sure that these things are going to work out in Brazil. I think the patterns I find here are going to be very different. Maybe there's more learning going on because you're trying more to get voters on your side in order to demonstrate to any leader that matters for you that you can bring votes, which you don't have to do in Mexico. Okay, and then finally the statistical question. Why do you want to do? So, take Laren's class. So one of the things, and I wrote about this a little bit in the paper because most people haven't used the spatial econometrics, is that when you are interdependent and what you do affects what other people do, your errors are correlated. And so what you're producing, if you don't include a spatial weights matrix that's capturing that interdependence, you're producing biased coefficients on your models with for any coefficient that might also be affected by that interdependence. So you could be overestimating those coefficients or underestimating. And so you can't trust your results if you're not accounting for this, what's called this error that could be creeping in. And so the reason that you want to use the spatial econometrics, if you think that there's this kind of interdependence, if you think that my debt decision affects my copartisans' debt decisions or my neighbor's debt decisions, you have to include a matrix in there that accounts for the way that you're interacting with your copartisans or your neighbors in order to kind of get rid of that bias from your model. So I trust my coefficients up here, and then it's here because I've gotten rid of that potential omitted variable bias. So these are pretty good estimates here because I don't have that problem. And in the row term is what is telling me that I was in fact right, at least for bond debt here and for oddly trust debt and for the commercial bank debt, that there is that interdependence going on and I should have accounted for it.
Jefferson, you had a question? No? Okay. Other questions? Yes? Lucas. You have to come up here.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I'm Lucas. I'm a PhD student here at the department. I'm going to insist on Jonathan's theoretical question. I also haven't read the paper. I was trying to quickly read it to not make any mistakes. But my question is that your argument in the paper, if I understood it by a quick read, is that it is important to do these policies to build the governors to build their political careers. Mm-hmm. But as you were explaining, I was trying to understand the Mexican political system because I tried to think about Brazil, I tried to think about the United States, and the governors, to me, seems like they have established political careers. They don't need to build their careers. They already have their established careers, and they don't need... if they are looking up, as you said, in their careers, they only have the presidency or maybe the Senate to do so. Mm-hmm. But if they're already the governors, they are important political leaders in their states. And in the Brazilian political system, they wouldn't need national support to run to the Senate, for example. So they would only need that in order to run for the presidency. Mm-hmm. So I think the theoretical argument works better for mayors and local politicians than for governors. But that's pretty much it. Thank you.
That's a good observation, and that's an important observation. So when I wrote the argument, yes, I had in mind mayors. So you had more rungs on the ladder to climb before your career was actually over. But governors' careers aren't over either. What do governors in Brazil actually just go to sleep after they want to get reelected? They want to stay important party leaders in the state. They would like to get into the national party in some positions. Sometimes in Mexico, the national parties have the executive boards, which are really important, and you get a lot of influence in shaping the party's platform, determining who gets on national ballots, who becomes president. So maybe there are some governors that don't want to continue, but on average, most do want to continue and would like to be thought of as having done a good job. And so if you just slack off and don't compete and just let things slide under your leadership in your state, then you have no political career at all left over to you, and that can actually hurt you. So in a country like Mexico, in a country like Mexico where there's a lot of corruption, you're not just trying to move up in your party to maintain your good name and potentially be a player in national level politics and national level platform building and the decision of who gets financing for their campaigns, et cetera, and who gets determined the fate and the future of the party. You're also trying to prevent yourself from being prosecuted for corruption. Okay, so I don't think that governors in any political system just want to go back to their old jobs. They don't have old jobs to go back to. They've spent their entire lives, most of them, in building their political careers, and maybe they're governor at 60. Well, I don't think that they think that their careers are over necessarily. Some, of course, but on average, no. So, and I think that they also owe it to, another way to think about this is not just the fact that they're trying to move up, that they have a lot of people dependent on them for their careers, and for them to continue helping all the people below them move up to state level, stay in state government after they leave, and move up potentially to higher level office. If they slough off, that they're not able to do that then. So I see your point, but I completely disagree that they're willing to just go quietly into the forest when they're done. I think that they need to continue, if not for themselves, for all of the people that they've brought up from local to state government and potentially putting on the ballot winning national elections. They need to continue to maintain their stature. So, yeah.
Otras preguntas? No? Acho que we're done. I think we're good. So, Allyson? Oh, Natalia? Yes? Okay.
Thank you, Allyson. I have a very basic question about, I was looking and thinking about your results and thinking about the past and how we can maybe explain your the debts, if they are most driven by the past of the state. So if a state that had a lot of debts in the past, or the governor from the same party that was in the past, because I look at and I saw that the lag of the dependent verb is very high, and then I was thinking, what matters more, if it's the neighbor or if it is? I was looking at the yes.
Go to the, yeah, go ahead.
Which I was thinking, what matters more, if it's the past of the state or if it's the neighbors? The neighbors, no, I'm sorry, the partisan. Exactly. Thank you.
Well, I see this as a control. So the lag is controlling for prior debt. And so what we're picking up in the dependent variable is anything that's not explained by the prior debt. So I don't see that as a problem. Of course, I expected it to be high because this is your rolling debt, how much you're indebted every year. So you certainly have to control for how indebted you were the prior year.
But it could be that, so it could be that once you become in debt, you have to continue, right? You have to continue, you're in a trap.
You're in a debt trap. Well, yes and no. Everyone is. I mean, what state isn't? What government isn't? I mean, which is why I control for all their kinds of debt.
Yes.
I don't want to overspecify the models, but I'd also put in like change in past debt and all of that, but it's the same result. Because it's not that you're trapped in a debt cycle per se, it's that I was thinking about the reason to put all those lags in is to control for prior debt, but also to control for your access to debt. Because how much debt you have should have an impact on your subsequent debt. And so you would expect the more indebted you are, the harder it would be for you to get access to debt, and yet they're still getting access to debt.
Right. Well, Allyson, it's been a wonderful seminar, and we've learned a lot. For those of you who want, Allyson is undertaking part of the work with FAPESP is we're going to be doing a lot of research on fiscal policy in Brazil this year. So for those of you who are interested and who want to talk more with Allyson, please do write to her, be in touch. But also, if you're interested in learning more about the project, I think this is an example of some of the work that Allyson's hoping to develop comparatively for Brazil. So there's lots of opportunities for students to help and to learn from Allyson's work this year that she's here with us. So thanks a lot, Allyson, and welcome.
Thank you.
This is hard once you grab it. You realize it's going to fall,
It's
so
really
you have to
safe.
hang on.
But Lucas, I have to say, though, I don't talk about that in the paper, my response, and I need to put it in. I need to put it in. No, you were so right.
I was afraid that I
was
missing something.
No, you weren't missing anything, but I think it deserves another paragraph to just say why I can test this on governors and why it's not the end. You're welcome, and not the end of their careers. That they still have to be important for a couple of reasons.
Yeah, because I was thinking only about the political ambition theory.
Right.
They want office, but it's not only office, so
Yeah.
not only elected office. So
It's just maintaining their stature.
yeah, but and I was also thinking a lot about this because when you get to the governorship, you already have a statewide control of the party and everything, so you wouldn't need to be answering too much to the national leaders.
Which is why I don't think that this is going to work in Brazil, what I've done. I think it's going to be, I'm going to have very different dynamics here. And I hope so. I think it'll be more fun because if I find exactly the same thing here, then I'll wonder, well, what is really going on? Because Brazil is so different than Mexico in the political environment, how you get access to the ballot, how you build your career, you can move around more.
Yes.
Here you can skip, and in Mexico you don't skip. It's very pyramidal. Yeah. And in here, it's just not like that. In Mexico, it's not like that, but here, it's so different. So I'm not anticipating getting the same kinds of results. I hope I find something different that can be explained by the differences in the political system.
How are you dealing with this wide range of parties?
I don't know. That's why I'm here. I'm here for a whole year. I am aware of Brazil. I'm aware of the electoral system. Any Latin Americanist is. We've all read. We've read the Limongi and company people. We've read the Barriames and company people. We know what's going on, more or less, or at least have the views about how the party system works and how the electoral system affects the party system. But I don't know how to handle it in a data sense, because how are you going to, the vertical partisan alignment thing was going to be really hard for that reason. So we'll have to develop different codings, which is why I'm here to learn about that and how people have dealt with those problems in the past, because I won't be the first person that's done this.
There's probably going to be some ideology measure.
Exactly, because the name isn't going to be enough.
Yeah.
So I'll just have to see what other people have done here and then adapt those to what I'm doing.
It's really neat.
Thanks.
It's a great seminar. Yeah, I studied a little bit of political careers. That's why I got that.
Yeah. Well, we should talk. I'm here, so
Yes, yeah.
anytime. I'd like to hear about your work.
Thank you for the lecture.
You're welcome.
I have just one question.
Sure.
How do you know that the most important policy area for the partisan leadership is the fiscal deficit?
I have no idea.
Because it could be, for example, the reduction in the unemployment rate, or I don't know, the reduction in the inequality level. Other policy areas could be more important for the partisan leadership than.
You're right, but there are two things to think about. First of all, I just assume that they're also competing with each other or learning from each other under either logic on these other policy realms. So I assume that's already happening, and I'm just looking at the deficits and what they're doing with their fiscal policy, assuming that they're probably doing something similar with other policy areas, either with tax extractive policy or with spending policy, so how they're spending, how they're choosing to spend the money. So if I think what I find here probably happens in other policy areas. I don't think it's the most important. But the reason why I'm looking at the fiscal policy is because I want to put this in the fiscal policy literature, the literature on budget cycles and when parties engage in deficits and when they engage in surplus, fiscal surplus. So it's purely because I want to talk to that literature and show a gap in that literature that I think is really important, that no one's been taking into account. But I certainly don't think it's the most important thing that they do. Also, I think it's the first thing they do, though. Because first, you have to decide, maybe not on paper, but you have to decide as a party, given our political context, given whether or not we're aligned with the president, given whether or not we're in an election cycle, are we going to run a deficit or are we going to run a balanced budget? That's the first decision. And then all tax and then spending policies come after that. So I don't think the tax and spending policies come first. Yeah, I don't think that they take those decisions individually. I think the first decision that they have to make is they have to decide, are we going to need to run a balanced budget or can we run a fiscal deficit this year? If so, then that has effects on what your tax policy is going to be and what your expenditure policies are going to be. And that's when some things might be fixed because they are supposed to spend a certain amount, but other things they might be able to innovate a little bit, and they might learn or compete, or they might innovate. I actually think there's probably more innovation going on, because once they decide their fiscal policy and then they start copying, then they have to decide, how do I distinguish myself? So I think they're innovating on what taxes to collect, and I think they're innovating on how to spend the money that they do collect or that they're spending. So I think of it as like that's the second step, but you could be right. It could be you decide, I'm going to spend like this
I'm going to implement this social policy, and then I'll just take the deficit that I get with that or afterwards. But I'm not sure that that's how it works at the subnational level.
Yeah, they studied the Russian political system, and there is this kind of pressure to get a lower level of fiscal deficit, but it's more like the governors are afraid of the president, so they are not competing between them, but they are afraid of losing that. Yes, they are afraid of losing.
Well, they're maybe not competing across, but they're competing with other potential people within their states. And so if you don't do well, then the autocrat might replace you. So you are competing. Because you need to look like you're doing well and keeping everything under control. Meaning social protest under control, deficit, everything under control, the system, the votes.
The best governors, they can go higher in the federal structure. But in the practice, there are not so much cases of governors that
move up.
That got another.
But the logic is still there. Maybe you're not trying to rise; you're just trying to survive, and that's it. But I think, but you could be competing to survive. You're either learning or competing. So maybe they're just learning from each other, but maybe they're competing. I don't know. But an authoritarian. Yes, and I know Dan Treisman because he was at UCLA when I was a graduate student. He's amazing. He does great work.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you very
you
much
too.
for the lecture. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks.
Ah.